Welcome to week 6 of our food systems seminar focusing on food supply chains during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we'll orient as usual with our familiar FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization framework of food systems for diets and nutrition. And as we've been doing, we're going to focus mostly on the food supply chain component of this food systems framework. But you'll notice today that we're really going to focus in on retail and markets, on that sector of food supply chains. And we'll also have an opportunity to consider impacts to food environments that consumers might have been experiencing and probably were experiencing in the context of changes and impacts from the pandemic, and also resulting changes in consumer behavior. So up until now, we've heard from multiple presenters who have referenced the challenges to shifting pressures, particularly on the food and grocery supply chains. And so we've had a number of readings, including those from today, that have cited these empty grocery store shelves and even some of the shortages or the various pressures that have led to these empty shelves. And for one of your readings today, which was from August of last year, it started off by kind of detailing some of the many ways that COVID has affected people's lives, particularly around being able to access food in ways that are most familiar to us. So company supply chains were affected, unemployment rates were rising, stay-at-home orders shifted the opportunity and timing of consumption. Shortages did occur, and then they temporally changed as well as we shifted through the different stages of the pandemic. Today, we get to hear from someone who is really on the front lines of grocery supply chain management, who will tell us more and firsthand about the pressures and impacts of the past year in terms of to the grocery supply chain. And so it's my great pleasure and great gratitude as well that I get to introduce Scott Owen, our speaker for today. And Scott is a senior grocery merchandiser with PCC Community Markets. And Scott has worked in local grocery since 1988, first with Thriftway and then moving to online with the brief but exciting venture known as homegrocer.com. He has been with PCC Community Markets since 2001 in store management and then moved to merchandising in 2007. He has been the senior grocery merchandiser for the past half a dozen years. His primary focus there is developing local brands, building private labels, and creating synergy with the local food web. And I'll just say that Scott also provided the connection that we had in the seminar to Donnie Wilcox from Wilcox Family Farms. And so that is, he's also a grand networker, I will say, from personal experience. Mr. Owen is also part of the Northwest Agricultural Business Center Regional Food Systems Partnership Steering Committee, as well as working with the Pacific Coast Collaborative Dairy Working Group, attempting to reduce food waste within the dairy system. Scott, we're so glad you're here. Really grateful that you could make the time. Welcome. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you.
All righty, there we go. So hopefully you can see this okay and hear me all right. So yeah, 2020, it was a very interesting year, I think, for, well, everybody, no matter where you were in the world. Certainly in my little corner of retail, we never experienced anything like this. So, you know, when you think about supply chains, you know, it's really pretty normal to use big data. People are very predictable in their buying habits. You know, we know what days people are going to buy the most items. We know what days they're going to shop before a holiday, you know, and all of this is just kind of ingrained into our everyday lives, those of us that are involved in this. So when something abnormal happens, it can be something that we have seen before and can deal with, something like a snowstorm, for example. We know there's going to be a run-up in purchasing of certain items. So we warn the stores, we try and make sure our distributors have those things on hand. It's pretty routine. What happened with COVID, there was just really nothing routine about it. It's what looked like could be a small snow-like event where people were ramping up turned into full-on a very long winter and summer, and then winter again of just unprecedented purchasing and having to modify what we buy and who we buy it from almost constantly, which is not normal in our line of work. So if you look at the little cartoon I have there, especially the one that's the supply chain manager. So what I think I do is a lot of cat herding. And yes, what I really do is I spend a lot of time on the phone and a lot of time in email verifying stock allocations, changing distributors. I mean, basically anything and everything that you can think of that surrounds getting food from one place and into our stores is what I spent the majority of 2020 doing. So a supply chain, one of the reasons it's called a supply chain is just very simple. It's a linked system where that chain gets pulled along, and as long as all those links are strong, everything goes pretty normally, right? So what happened in, starting in January of 2020, but really hitting us in March of 2020, is some of those links started to break. And once you get one link in a chain that is broken, the other links become more susceptible. And once many of those links are broken, then you basically have what happened in March, which is we had pretty much a supply chain catastrophe, which is very unusual. Like I said, people's buying habits are pretty regulated. They're very well understood, and there's not a lot of surprises. Everything about the beginning part of 2020 told us it was going to be a normal year, much until it was not a normal year due to COVID. We really know that customers were feeling sensitive at about, here, I got a little timeline here for you. Get this to advance here. So this is basically the Q1 sales by day for my stores. And you can see the peaks are basically weekends. And this is a very normal buying pattern. We always sell more Friday, Saturday, and Sunday than we do the rest of the week. And the sales patterns have this very predictable sort of sawtooth pattern. On January 1st, the first case of COVID was diagnosed and reported in the media in Washington state. And you can see it didn't really cause too much of a ripple at that stage of the game. Although the overall sales trajectory is up, it really is biased by what happened in March. So we go through several more weeks where more or less normal buying patterns are established. You can see towards the end of February, though, between the reports of more people getting sick and then the report of the first death, we saw our first large spike in sales. And this was where we thought this might be more like a snowstorm, where it's a temporary peak, the supply chain recovers after that. And what usually happens in these events is people buy large amounts of fresh items like milk, eggs, bread, things, again, that can be replenished relatively quickly from the warehouses. Their usage then after the event goes back to normal and the supply chain evens out. And what happened after this was the new portion of this that COVID brought in. There was a small lull, as I think there was just a lot of confusion and uncertainty as we went through the beginning part of March, where Comic-Con was delayed, where we saw like the St. Patrick's Day parade was canceled, the fun run was canceled. These things that are pretty institutionalized on a year-to-year basis didn't happen, and it sort of stunned people. And so we saw this slight lull in sales, although higher than what we would normally see. The peaks and valleys weren't tremendous. Then the stay-at-home order hit on the 11th, and I think that's when it really hit people that things were different than what they had seen before. We were no longer in a snowstorm-like event. We were in, well, what turned out to be very uncharted territory. So the supply chain really started getting hammered. We started seeing unprecedented weeks of sales, and that happened for about 4 solid weeks. We saw the supply chain be actually quite resilient. We noticed, again, what people were buying, what we might have been running out of. We started compensating with different distributors buying and filling in with different items, all very much normal for what we would have happen again in an extended event, but things were keeping up. The best thing I can describe, though, is, we use the term supply chain, but it's also like a pipeline, right? So as long as that pipe is full and everybody draws from that pipe and it never empties too far, everything's fine. No shortages or empty shelves will be noticed. But once one end of that supply chain gets cut off or severely depleted, and it keeps flowing steadily out the other side to consumers, well, the supply in that pipeline lowers and lowers until there's nothing left. And that's kind of what we started seeing towards the end of March. The supply chain basically had too many links broken in it. It was bottomed out, there was nothing left, and it kind of broke the whole system. Some of this was due to labor issues, some of this was due to supply chains from basically all over the world, and there are some lingering effects that we'll talk about towards the end as well too, but it really, you've heard unprecedented a million times, but it absolutely is true. This is a completely unprecedented occurrence within our supply chain that we didn't really have any way of coping with, except to just dive into the information, resource as much as we could, and try and fill the shelves. And there was a lot of challenges that we faced that I'm not going to necessarily get into from suppliers and whatnot. Suffice it to say, though, that third week in February where sales trended for us, we hit our normal sales in my department are about, at the time, were just a little over $2 million a week, and we hit 3.9 million in 1 week. So it nearly doubled our output off the shelving through the stores. It's an awful lot of product, and it created so much pressure on the supply chain, and then the labor side of that really sort of broke our supply chain. And not too long after that, that's when you started seeing the decline in sales. That's when we started seeing the outages really manifest in the stores because we couldn't get resupplied. And so our sales dropped quite precipitously. And until we could rebuild that supply chain with other distributors, we started seeing these large holes. We see toilet paper pointed to a lot, and I still don't know exactly why toilet paper was such a focus in the beginning, but I do know it was a focus throughout the early stages of the pandemic, mostly just because of social media and media reporting that there were shortages. And of course, when you see empty shelves, that is going to lend people to think, well, there really is a shortage and maybe I should probably go get some. That creates more of a shortage because it just increases the buying pressure on what then started to become a limited resource. Obviously, not too long after that, the recovery of toilet paper for example, was hampered by the inability to manufacture it fast enough. And it just kind of one thing leads to another at that stage of the game. So kind of just looking for comparison. So March 2019 versus March 2020. And again, this is my little corner of the retail, but it is somewhat representative of what most major retailers saw to varying degrees. We source probably more of our product through local distributors and manufacturers than most stores do. When things went really bad in March, we actually pulled from our primary supplier the sourcing of much of our private label product, which all comes from local farms, to other local distributors that could handle it better. Again, this was more of a labor situation than it was a supply chain interruption. The product was there, it's just they couldn't get enough people into the warehouse to actually pick the loads and ship them out. So it was an example where even though some aspects of the supply chain remained strong, there weren't enough people there to actually get it to the stores. So we kind of farmed that out back to the local suppliers, which were not having the same issues, to try and get these much needed products to our stores. So we did this for a number of months, and it really helped us stay in business and get those sort of critical things. You know, in an event like what happened, people really didn't care what brand of milk we had. We just had to have milk, and they didn't care what kind of eggs we were carrying. We had to have eggs. So to do a lot of these things, we brought on new distributors. In fact, we brought on 13 new distributors and about 500 new products in the space of about 4 weeks. We started sourcing from restaurant chains, not the restaurants themselves, but their supply chains. You know, so when we couldn't get the 15-ounce size can of tomatoes on the shelf, we had the number 10 can size, which is a pretty institutional size, but it's something that we were able to buy from these local supply chains that weren't selling to restaurants at the time, once things actually shut down after the governor's order. And it put something on the shelf. Now, not everybody can use a number 10 can size of tomatoes, but they actually sold remarkably well. So some kind of relevant dates from our standpoint in retail. So the week of 3/15, that was our all-time record sales, and that 8.8 million is actually for all stores in all departments. Like I said, the sales for my department, which is grocery, were 3.9 million of that. So the 3/15 date, highest sales ever, and that's the date that our primary supplier, UNFI, had such labor issues that they were no longer able to pick our loads and deliver them in a timely manner. And we get 7-night-a-week delivery from them. That Sunday, 3/15, we actually didn't get those orders that we had placed that morning until about 10 o'clock. Well, between 7 and 10 at night the following Monday. And we'd already placed orders Monday, which got canceled, and it just created a very big snowball effect. As we started to recover, and it only took us a couple of weeks of sort of struggling with really low quantities to start to recover, we started just ordering truckloads. So one of the management systems we put in place is if we could get something in large quantity, we would. And it might not, again, be the normal brand that we carried with the normal amount of variation and flavors that we would carry, but it was enough to fulfill our needs. And we would either store that at a primary distributor like UNFI or a secondary distributor. In fact, I still have products at some secondary distributors from that time that we're slowly pushing out to the stores. So we started at the end of March buying full truckloads of product. We reached out to some of our other distribution chain partners. We're part of the NCG, the National Cooperative Grocers Association. We reached out through them and brought in 2 truckloads of dry goods about 4,600 cases. It sounds like a lot, but basically that was in and out of our stores in less than a week. But again, it fulfilled a need, and for the time that we could have it. So it was definitely sort of a running exercise in supply chain refulfillment, somewhat less management, and just scrambling for products. So the just some of the fun numbers, and I say fun sort of tongue in cheek, but all store sales, we had about an $11 million increase between the two Marches. The deli, actually, their sales shrank because as we went through the varying stages of the governor's orders, the deli was the most affected because they had to shut down things like salad bars and the hot bars, things like that. And so their sales actually retracted, and they're still in the process of rebuilding those. Our sales, of course, jumped up pretty dramatically, $6 million in that March area. Beer and wine rose dramatically, and just as one of those fun things, beer and wine is still one of those areas now that we're nearly a year into this COVID experience. Beer and wine sales are still about 40% up. It's definitely a coping method to get through COVID. And fun fact, frozen desserts, ice cream, about 60% up right now. So also a coping method. HBC, that's our health and body care. They had pretty dramatic increases as well, although they're down a little bit right now at the beginning. Anything vitamin supplement, vitamin D's, Sambuca, all those things were things people were buying kind of almost speculatively, just in case it could help against COVID. Meat department was and continues to be a primary driver for sales right now, because again, so many people are cooking at home. It's just one of those items, whether it be protein or plant-based protein from my departments, sales are just fantastically high. And our produce department, same thing. That's just feeding, whether it be fresh or it's an ingredient in cooking, sales are tremendously high for side dishes and just fruits and veggies in general. So in March of 2019, one of our highest demand items was field day canned beans. We sold just a little over 20,000. To give you a comparison, we sold 96,000 cans of beans in March of 2020. Our PCC eggs, which is our best-selling dozen eggs, 8,600 units. Fast forward a year, 26,000 units. Our milk, which is, again, it's a very stable consumable item. That's very predictable what the sales are going to be. Almost 22,000 half gallons to 41,000 half gallons. And again, we just never really seen anything like that. And of course, toilet paper. Basically 10,000 units versus 37,000. We probably would have sold more if we could have gotten a hold of it, but March was, like I said, sort of a running battle just to have enough toilet paper of any size or brand on the shelf, just to keep things going. It was interesting to me on the produce side, bananas and avocados were number one, and they remain to be number one. People didn't really change their habits there. They just purchased more of them. Beer and wine, 40 Nights Cab and good old Pabst Blue Ribbon was the number two. So that was sort of interesting to see. 5 of the top 10 movers were either a meat item or a PCC private label item on the grocery side. Sales of basically everything were just through the roof. Like I said, the deli lost a little bit of ground, and they've been working to regain that. But one of the things that has done really well is cheese. People are having basically charcuterie and cheese with a glass of wine at home much more frequently than normal. So that was another kind of one of those interesting increases to see happen. So departmental, This is just a simple graph showing basically the year of sales level of all of the departments. My department runs a little higher sales than most of the departments, and you can see also our peaks tend to be higher and also sometimes lower depending on what's going on than the other departments. But with the exception of the deli and HPC right now, all of our departments are up. Grocery, you know, that big peak happened in March. It's very normal for us to also see at the beginning of grilling season a nice peak, and that definitely happened again. Likely it happened with less groups, but it still happened. People still wanted to get outside when it got sunny in the Pacific Northwest. We then get into a little bit of a lull as the hot part of summer comes around, people going out for vacations, things like that, although definitely vacations had a different context in 2020. We know they still happened just by the sales patterns. And then as we get back to school, and again, school had a different concept this year, we still saw that peak of sales happen again, because although the kids were schooling from home, there still was the need to have those lunch items. So sliced bread, meat, cheese, juice boxes, basically everything you can think of that goes into a brown bag skyrocketed in sales. It just was consumed at home instead of being consumed at the school. And the rate was greater because there was no school lunch to offset that need for a lunch, and it was just all at home. So definitely some interesting sales patterns, and some of the predictability that we saw was still there. It was just modified by what exactly was happening as far as stay-at-home orders and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, in the broadest sense, what we have seen happen is customers are shopping less frequently, but shoppers are buying more when they do shop. So it makes complete and total sense when you look at it from the customer's perspective, not wanting to increase their exposure to people out in the store. When they do go, they're just going to buy an awful lot more. And so that still has not really let up yet. People are still shopping bigger, but less frequently. That is just starting to show some signs of turning back to more normal patterns where people are shopping every few days or every week. But I suspect these large shopping patterns will continue. And also, we don't have it here as a separate graph, but online, of course, was an enormous growth mode for us. We about doubled our online sales through our partner. We deal with Instacart. And that persists to this day. Some people just are not comfortable enough to shop in person. And so that has provided, I think, an extremely beneficial outlet so that folks can have, you know, the normal foods from all the places that they would normally shop. And of course, I couldn't not throw a graph in on just toilet paper in general. You can see there was an enormous spike in toilet paper consumption, well, sales. And then, honestly, we know there was some factor of hoarding in this, just because that although usage of toilet paper is relatively constant, and we know that people aren't using it in stadiums and schools and office buildings to the same degree they're using it more at home, but the usage pattern is still declining. So that is one of the ways that we know that there was just a little bit of a hoarding mentality with toilet paper. So these are our year-over trends by category. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I'll go over some of the bigger ones. You know, I'd mentioned bread. Bread is actually my department's largest selling category. Sliced bread specifically, Como, Dave's Killer Bread, all that kind of fun stuff that you'd make toast or sandwiches out of. Huge sales, 30% increases. Refrigerated items of all type, whether it's tortillas or yin yang carrots or any other type of tofu, you know, over 40% sales increases there. And again, these are all ingredients that people are taking home and creating meals out of that they probably did before, but just not at the same rate. Bulk foods is the one department that really got hit hard for grocery retail, and us being a co-op especially, it is normally one of our top selling categories. But it was the one section, much like our deli, that got hit because we couldn't for a while even sell bulk. And then as we modified what bulk could be sold by working with the state of Washington health department, basically right now we're only selling things in bulk that require cooking. So we've had to push some of those sales into packaged goods and things like that that defray the impact of our bulk departments. By and large, though, they should recover at some point this year, but it really is one of those situations. It's one of our main driving forces being a co-op, and not to have that is sometimes a shame. Refrigerated beverages sales are up, but not as far up as they should be compared to the other top moving categories. And that's because the deli not having the breakfast, lunch, and dinner traffic that it normally would have. Typically, people are buying 1 or 2 beverages with that, and we're not seeing that right now. Baking, I'm sure you have seen this on the news and most likely experienced this yourself. People are baking cookies, brownies, breads have become very popular. People are experimenting with baking. Baking tends to take time and some experimentation, and people definitely did that. It's one of the fastest growing categories we've ever seen. You know, yeast and bread flour were in very short supply for a long time, but we're actually well recovered now, and we're still seeing great sales in baking. People seem to have really come up with a knack for baking and a love for baking, and so those sales have spilled over into 2021 as well. You know, our normal items like dairy, eggs, obviously great selling categories, normally doing very well now. You know, where people would maybe go out and have breakfast, you know, at a local diner or something like that. They're having that at home now, or those eggs are going into baked goods. So still doing very, very well. Candy, tremendous sales in candy. Sugar is definitely another coping mechanism. Frozen desserts is another one I would bring up. You know, you can see based off my comments earlier, 61% increase is just, it's phenomenal. It's just not something we're used to seeing in retail. We're used to seeing increases. A double-digit increase is a very good increase in retail year over year. And to see something, you know, in that 50 or 60 mark is just very unprecedented. It's quite remarkable. And again, since coffee shops haven't been open, people have been brewing at home. Coffee sales are through the roof. I mean, 67% growth is, again, just stellar. Again, because kids are at home, you're seeing things like cold cereal and hot cereal sales have gone up. One of the other categories that's down for us is energy bars. People have less of a need for that quick on-the-go nutrition bar that they might have in between meetings or something like that. And sales are down mostly because they just have the time to cook or have a more extensive, you know, snack while they're at home. So pizzas, basically anything in the international category is doing well. People are very active experimenting with different types of cuisine that either they're not familiar with, or maybe they are familiar with, but they're really able to sort of dig into the category now. And it's been really fun to see those categories just really do well. So, you know, this is just a little bit of a brief snippet. This is the fun part, honestly, for us as retailers now, to see what people are doing and how they're experimenting and try and react to that with new products. This is kind of like what 2021 is about, since COVID's still here, trying to figure out fun and new things that the consumers are looking for and providing that now that most everything's available again. We're still seeing shortages in many categories. But a lot of the supply chain challenges that we saw in 2020 weren't necessary intuitively because of the supply chain necessarily breaking. It was just because the consumption went up so high. And so like crops like beans and oats and rice, since that harvest is finite, what we ended up seeing is that 2019 harvest was planned very carefully to have that sort of just in time, truck to shelf mentality. But because things ramped up so much, basically people purchased most of the supply for those items from the 2019 harvest by mid 2020, and the new harvests weren't either harvested yet, or they weren't processed and dried and packaged and ready to send out. So definitely a lot of challenges there. Packaging is another huge issue. We have a spice supplier who has the spices, and so we have them now in the bulk department that we're allowed to have bulk again, but they can't find the jars to put them in. They're having a really hard time sourcing them, so that means we still have a shortage of like jarred cumin and other spices. Nylon, that was another thing. The alcohol for sanitizing wipes, which you probably went through 3 or 4 months not being able to find them on the shelf. The alcohol that acts as the sanitizer was actually in fantastic supply. It was the nylon substrate, which again, that all comes from overseas. And without the ability to get that, it's an incomplete product. So shortage is there. We touched a bit on paper products. The recovery was slow. That pipeline was drained. Manufacturers were struggling to keep up and refill that pipeline, which constantly got pulled on very heavy. Things are pretty good now. We're still seeing intermittent shorts, but for the most part, we're able to keep up with, one of the brands that we carry, and it's not that big a deal. Labor is still an issue, though. We just had an issue a couple of weeks ago where one of the primary distribution warehouses for one of the brands we carry, Field Day, they had a COVID outbreak, and between that and the contact tracing, over 100 people in the warehouse were out for 3 weeks, and it essentially took them 6 weeks after that to fully recover, get all the POs out, and get that pipeline refilled. So those issues will continue through 2021. It'll be hard to know exactly what is going to happen with them or where they're going to creep up. Rest assured, one thing though, buyers like myself will try and move around them and supply other products so that you don't see shorts. You might not see your favorite brand, but you will see a brand. I guess that would be the easiest way to put it. So, and then, by year's end, not everything was back in stock, but like I said, something was in stock, and that will continue to happen. We'll continue to see that. So will the current trends of baking, coffee, quick meals at home continue? Yes, I really do think they will. They will back down a little bit in intensity, but I definitely think they will continue. Supply disruptions will continue, and I want you to think about not necessarily what's happening in the US, but what's happening in second and third world nations. These outbreaks will affect them as well as they affect the United States. The fact though is, until a shelf-stable version of a vaccine is available, there are going to be areas that just won't see a vaccine because there isn't the ability to have that -70 refrigeration, which is, I don't want to say commonplace, but is not too terribly hard to find in the United States and other first world nations. It is much more rare in other places. So we'll never really know when those disruptions happen, but they will cause down chain disruptions, especially if it's a key ingredient. So the long and the short of it is, the local supply chain for us definitely saved us through 2020. It is something that we and I have focused on a lot at PCC, and I'm glad we have, because it really did help us, and it gave me the confidence to know that we really need to double down on our local supply chain and the food web that we have within the counties around here. So, there's going to be a lot of things that may pop up over 2021, but rest assured, I think the supply chain, the resilience is back, and we should be in pretty good shape with most products. That's really all I've got, and I appreciate you listening to me, and there are any questions, please let me know.
Scott, thank you so very much for just laying all of that out for us, just the kind of year-over-year comparisons, and then pointing out the trends and kind of the changes that have been noted from your industry, and then also sharing your reflections on what allowed the supply chain to be resilient in the ways that it has been, and particularly for PCC. And so I was really struck by that last comment, that last reflection that you shared about sort of wanting to double down on the local food web, and also struck by an earlier comment about the number of new relationships and new supply lines that you developed early on. And so, yeah, I just would love to hear a little bit more about both the opportunity to do that in our region and the challenges, whichever of those resonate for you.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of both. I mean, the opportunities abound. And I think part of the fact that we've extended ourselves as a company to like, hey, we're local. If you're local, come say hi to us. That is fantastic. And we really do try to embrace it, like I said. The challenge of it, though, is a lot of these small local producers are very time consuming to get to a point where they're ready for retail. My team is still the same size that it has been the last many years. So with this influx of new local, sometimes if it's in a category where there's a lot of sales and we can kind of, get them into the shelf, sort of on training wheels, basically, that is definitely something we try to do. The last month or two, I've been really encouraging, especially the organizations, the different farm to table organizations that are holding a lot of these, meet the producer events, things like that, really encouraging them to get distributors involved in these meetings. It is so much easier for me to work with a distributor that I already know, we already have the relationship set up with. And that's everything from having insurance to having distribution contracts, just the whole myriad of the business end of things. It's the exact same amount of time to do that for a distributor as it is to do for a single producer that's delivering one thing to our store. So there's a lot of economy of scale if they're at a point where they could get to a distributor, but sometimes they're really just too small to attract a distributor's attention. And that's where we'll attempt to provide a little bit more hand-holding in that respect. But yeah, I've probably been contacted by 40 or 50 companies since January 1st. And each one's about a 20-hour commitment to get them into our store. So a lot of times I'm like, yes, we're interested, but you're in a line. So you've got to be patient and don't email me every day. I won't forget you're there, but it could be 1 to 6 months before I can actually act upon the desire to have you stocked in our stores.
Thank you. And yeah, the amount of time that you're describing and the depth of the relationship that's needed to support these emerging producers or processors of our region, it's remarkable to see behind the scenes, and to get a glimpse into what is needed to support that kind of local food web that you described. I have another question, Scott. You mentioned just remarkable numbers in terms of some of the jumps that you saw in the past year, these 200% to 300% increases in demand for canned beans and eggs and milk and toilet paper, and of course also alcohol and ice cream and candy. I noted that as well. But I also noticed you mentioned meat, being a real staple of consumption, and also some increases there, but I'm not sure that I saw it in the year-over-year detail for each category. And so I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit more about the kind of meat scene, meat availability within our region, if that is indeed where you're sourcing the meat from. And the reason I'm asking is because, we've also heard a lot about slaughterhouses and processing plants and the impacts that they've experienced en masse and throughout this country and others. And we're not able to include that perspective in the seminar this year. So I just want to open the floor if you have any insight to share with us about some of the challenges that industry
I can
faces.
certainly tell you a little bit. I didn't include it in the year over year because selfishly, I just represent the grocery department. So I was more speaking to just what I know best. But I can tell you, most of the meat that we sell at PCC is sourced locally. Not all of it, but a very large chunk of it. There's several chicken farms or poultry farms, I guess you should say, as you go up north from here, Linden being the biggest one with Ranger. And they operate at a scale that is much less intense than what you see in the news with like a Hillshire Farms like style mega producer that is producing for all 50 states and probably several countries, in one giant supply chain. We're dealing with, again, local farms that are at a smaller capacity and have the ability to spread out and do continue production in a way that's still safe. They've done a really amazing job of not affecting their own ability to produce product by, again, ramping up safeties and food security and hygiene and all that kind of fun stuff, all very quickly, because they know that if they have a major outbreak, it actually is much more detrimental to them than it would be for one of the mega producers. And as far as sales go, right now they're at about 40% increase. It sort of matches what we see in veggie protein. So anything like Beyond Meat or just straight up tofu, we're seeing about the same increases on the grocery side. So again, that sort of center of the plate protein item, people are loving the ability to experiment and cook at home. The variety is, been of what people have requested has been pretty astounding. I know on the beef side, Oregon Natural Beef is one of our larger suppliers. And again, for them, this has been pretty easy shift. They really just had to ramp up all their biosecurity and everything that happens in their plants. So their chicken is probably the primary protein right now of choice for most home consumers.
Thank you, and thanks for also being willing to entertain questions outside of like your particular management. But the ability to hear from you, and to get this broad scale perspective on the challenges that you've been facing, but also the remarkable agility and flexibility that you've been able to respond with is really remarkable. I think that's probably all the time that we have for questions. So I just want to take this chance to just thank you again. I hope we get a chance to connect again, on the other side of this, so that we can just hear the end of the story. And we'll be happy to have you back whenever that's possible. It was wonderful to host you and to learn more with you today. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
All right. Bye-bye.